Chapter 1: The Dawn of the Guardian. Title: The Genesis of the Trust Guardian and the Birth of AI. In the heart of the bustling city, nestled among a forest of towering skyscrapers, a young man named Bidzil Bey found himself in the epicenter of the financial world. His office, dimly lit by the city's ambient glow, was a testament to the complex world he was about to navigate. Strewn across his desk were a myriad of financial reports, legal documents, and trust agreements, each one a piece of the intricate puzzle of trust administration and compliance. Bidzil was not just any young man. He was a legal prodigy, fresh out of law school, with a keen interest in the intersection of law, finance, and technology. His journey was just beginning, a journey that would lead him deep into the labyrinthine world of trust law, a world filled with fiduciary duties, asset conveyances, and beneficiary rights. His mission was clear: to revolutionize the way trusts were administered. He envisioned a future where the complexities of trust law could be simplified, where compliance could be ensured with the click of a button, and where transparency was not just a goal, but a reality. This was the genesis of the Trust Guardian, a concept that would merge the legal expertise of a trust officer with the efficiency and precision of artificial intelligence. It was a bold idea, one that would challenge the status quo and transform the industry. The birth of the syntactical trust was the first step in this journey. This innovative approach to trust administration harnessed the power of AI to streamline processes, enhance transparency, and strengthen compliance. It was a game changer, a tool that would redefine the way trusts were managed. As Bidzil delved deeper into the world of trust law, he began to understand the true potential of the syntactical trust. It was not just a tool, it was a paradigm shift, a new way of thinking about trust administration. And it was just the beginning.
Um, Again, in compliance officer training, learning to go from LBOs to LCOs is important. And you're going to have to understand how these things interact. First off, I want you to understand that the DTCC has implemented a replacement implementation. They actually replaced everything starting in 2011. And it was already started being integrated into the Accord Life and Annuity Standards, which is a global insurance standard. So they created a provision that took everything that was being leveraged on a UCC 5 in conjunction with a UCC 3, in conjunction with a UCC 1, they provided an implementation that will allow that Article 9 security interest to be monetized through reinsurance. And that infrastructure was done through the court registered investment system. It was actually done through what they call the structured settlement payment system. But see, this Chris calls it something different. The Chris calls it expunged funds. See, under structured settlement payments refers to the legal arrangement where there's a minor or an incapacitated person, hint, hint, someone who is unknowledgeable in contracts, who lacks the legal guardian, is represented by a next friend or appointed guardian, government, state. These payments are categorized by periodic disbursements and are funded by an obligation guaranteed by the United States government, state, etc. To initiate a structured settlement, the party responsible for funding it must provide the court, the CRIS, the DTC, with specific documentations, including a copy of the instrument that provides funding, that's going to be your charging documents, for the structured settlement, and an affidavit for an independent financial consultant who specializes in calculating the present value of that structured settlement. Compliance with these regulations and requirements ensure that the structured settlement is solely for the benefit of the beneficiary and is not subject to the interest payment and calculations as outlined in the legal government code. Expunged funds. Expunged funds, also known as dormant funds, refer to the personal property that is considered abandoned when it remains dormant for a period of 3 years. This is where those 1099 OIDs come in. Because see, on the 1099 OID, you can call it an original issue discount, is used to describe the funds that are typically 36 months or older. These funds are equivalent with one who reports on a 1099 OID form. And under Chapter 75 of the Property Code, see, bonds that exceed $100 are presumed abandoned, should be reported and delivered by the county or district court to the comptroller. The dormancy period for most property types are 3 years, except for wages, which have a dormancy period of 1 year. So if it's wages, 1 year. And if it's other types of property, 3 years. Hope you're picking up what I'm putting down. The claims to claim these expunged funds, individuals must file a report on or before November 1st. To claim these expunged funds, individuals must file a report on or before November 1st with the treasurer of the holder, providing the necessary details for the property owner, the last known address, blah, blah, blah. Why am I reading this? Because if you've been studying under compliance officer training, you understand that not only did the gloves come off, we've kind of given you the way to recapitalize your estate. Let's talk about the DTCC. The DTCC, Depository Trust Company, or Depository Trust Clearing Company. Let's be real clear. There's a DTC and a DTCC. Now I'm talking about the DTCC. But let's go back. I was talking to, let's go back here. The DTCC had an implementation procedure. This is why they've all gone to global legal identifiers and LEIs, because it was under the ability to provide reinsurance. And reinsurance is handled under Depository Trust Clearing Corporation. That's the DTCC. How all this stuff starts is it's actually put in place by the DTC, Depository Trust Company. And this Depository Trust Company has the ability to utilize what they call operational arrangements. All you guys that actually were in the Bitrix space over the weekend, I gave you my gift to you, the Depository Trust Company operational arrangements. You already have it inside the Bitrix. Matter of fact, it was posted inside the Bitrix on what date was it? It was posted inside of the Bitrix and the Depository Trust on October 13th. So as of October 13th, I don't want to hear, well, Mr. Bay, I didn't know, I didn't get it. Yeah, you did. You just didn't download it. You just didn't read. Depository Trust Company operational guidelines has laid out a very elaborate plan, the operational arrangements. See, it's going to talk about, because the very first part of this is the important legal information. It says the services described herein are provided by the DTCs pursuant to the terms and conditions of these operational arrangements. See, you want to know how to move this, how do I get access to my QSIP and all that? It's right here. It's right here. The services described herein are provided by the DTC pursuant to the terms and conditions of these operational arrangements, as well as the rules and procedures of the DTC, and or other arrangements of parties collectively, which are called agreements. All issuers of securities deposited at the DTC, agents, underwriters are required to adhere to the requirements stated in these operation agreements. So let's say this again unanimously. If you want to know how to use these securities, you need to know what? These operational arrangements. This is your process. I am not allowed to violate the Privacy Act of 1974, but because I've given you the manual, you can legally ask me questions from this manual to monetize your securities. But you're going to have to read the information. Reading is fundamental. Understand, all I'm here to do is to offer you the truth, nothing more, nothing less. I hope you guys are picking up what I'm putting down, because after you read this important legal information, and I'm going to tell you what page it's on. Matter of fact, you got the triple E, then you got the table of contents. Table of contents is going to talk about eligibility requirements. It's going to talk about all that good stuff, but here's the kicker. Requirements for DTC services or securities. That's on page 14 and page 18. It talks about the standards. It talks about QSIP number assignments. It talks about certificate formats. Legends. I'm going to say it again slowly. Legends. transfer requirements, possession and inspections, balancing securities, and what's that? FAST. Who knows what FAST is? Yeah, I know it spells fast, but what does FAST stand for? FAST stands for the Federal Accounting Symbols and Titles. This is what you need to put on your UCCs. This is what you need to put on your documentation. This is what you need to put in your accounting, so everybody who's playing this let's pretend game know what you mean. I hope you guys are picking up what I'm putting down. I appreciate everybody's participation. Look, do not go nowhere because
in this and the next lecture, we're going to be taking a look at a set of financials for 10 major United States companies, which, as I mentioned at the end of the last lecture, have a set of financials with them, except that we haven't identified which set of financials belongs to which company, and that's the job we have for the day. The argument that we're using is that if the accountants did a good job of painting the picture of the company, and if we understand what the company ought to look like, then we should recognize which set of financials belongs to which company. We'll get an opportunity to review a number of the concepts we've looked at before and add a few more ideas. And the basic idea that we have to add is that an understanding of how a business makes money can lead to a reasonably good description of how it has to structure itself financially. That is, that the balance sheet really ought to reflect what the company does for a living and how it makes money. So what I'd first like to do is what I suggested you give a try before this session, and that is we're going to look at each company in turn and figure out how do you make a buck in this business. In fact, that's the question I always ask my class back at school at the beginning of every session. Before we do anything else, we try to figure out how to make a buck in the business. My argument is, if you don't know how to make a buck, why should they take any advice from you? And the equivalent is to tell the surgeon, before you pick up the scalpel, I want to see your anatomy diploma. So with that in mind, let's take a look at the companies in order. The first is American Airlines. Now, we're not going to talk about the individual company. We're talking about how a company in that industry would make money. The individual company may do it differently. That's unfortunate in this case, but when we're doing case studies at school, that's what helps you understand why they're doing well or badly. How do they vary from our expectations? And again, that fits the argument we made earlier, that if you have a set of expectations before you look at financials, you'll learn a lot more. Well, okay, well, how do you make money in the airline business? Well, first of all, you don't want to fly too many different kinds of airplanes. That is, you want to simplify the fleet for a number of reasons. First of all, if you buy the same kind of airplanes, you can generally get them cheaper. It's also easier to finance a fleet, particularly if you buy standard airplanes. After all, a bank is going to be more willing to finance an airplane which, if they have to foreclose, they can fly off and sell to somebody else, than if you fly an airplane that nobody else in the world uses and therefore no one's interested in. Using the same kind of equipment also gives you more flexibility in crew assignments. It means that the cabin attendants are familiar with the safety operation of every airplane in the fleet, and so you don't have to worry about who gets assigned to what airplane. So it's much easier to make assignments. It's easier to do maintenance because the mechanics don't have to know how to maintain 14 different kind of airplanes. All they have to know is one or two. The parts inventories don't have to be as big because the same parts are used in every airplane. And in fact, the parts are universally available because if you're willing to buy a standard airplane, no matter where you fly, even if you don't maintain a parts depot at that airport, some entrepreneur will, because a half a dozen other airlines also fly the same kind of equipment into Heathrow or whatever airport you're going into. Now, this idea is not lost on the few big airframe manufacturers. They point that out to you when they try to peddle their airplanes to you. So it's not a big surprise that practically everybody in the world flies either a Boeing or a McDonnell Douglas or an Airbus. And the same thing applies to engines. Essentially, there are only 3 engine manufacturers left in the business among the big airlines: the Pratt & Whitney engine, the General Electric engine, and the Rolls-Royce engine. And this is so wherever you fly, you can get the airplane fixed. So number 1 requirement, keep it simple as far as the fleet goes. These airplanes are essentially fixed cost. It doesn't cost any more to put an additional passenger in the airplane if the seat is empty and you want to fill it. A little bit of extra fuel to fly that person, and incidentally a little extra fuel to fly the extra fuel. And meal service. Remember, I told you that there would be fraudulent Art Brucoil claims to call it food. So you need a little extra meal service, some peanuts and a Coke if you're going to put an additional passenger in. But essentially, any additional revenue is found money. So the name of the game is keep the seats busy, and you're all aware of how they do that. They'll offer discounts to people who, in the last minute, are willing to book a seat that otherwise would be empty. The price you pay to get that discount is you're not certain you're going to get on the airplane till the last minute. Incidentally, you don't offer those things to business travelers, though, because you know they have to fly. Then the other requirement to run a successful airline, it seems to me, is that all maintenance should be done on the ground. I don't think it's a good idea to try to maintain the aircraft in flight. One day we'll get to automated airplanes. I can recall there was a story about a recent experiment in that regard where the plane was taxiing down the runway and the loudspeaker came on, "Ladies and gentlemen, you're privileged to fly on the first fully automated airplane. You'll notice there's no cabin attendants, and I assure you there's no one up in the cockpit either. But don't worry, there are redundant systems to protect everything, and nothing can go wrong, can go wrong, can go wrong." Well, things can go wrong. Murphy's Law applies. But we want to do maintenance on the ground. Well, how do you assure you do that? Well, you do preventive maintenance and you do unscheduled maintenance. Preventive maintenance is scheduled maintenance, much like what you do for your car. Every X thousand miles you drive it in, or every so many months you drive it in and they change the oil. If you do enough scheduled maintenance, you'll do less unscheduled maintenance. And unscheduled maintenance is the least desirable because you don't know when that unscheduled maintenance is going to be needed, and it might even be in the air. To try to avoid unscheduled maintenance in the air, besides doing a lot of scheduled maintenance, you also have redundancy on the airplane. It's not an accident that there's more than 2 engines on an airplane. It's not an accident that there are at least 2 drivers in the cockpit. And almost all of the essential systems have redundancy, so if one fails, the airplane doesn't fall out of the sky. The exception are structural things. If you lose one wing, the airplane has a hard time flying. The other advantage of scheduled maintenance is that we can do that ourselves. In the case of American Airlines, for example, they fly the plane down to Dallas where they have a central depot and they do scheduled maintenance. If they find anything wrong, they don't hold the plane on the ground because remember that's a fixed cost item in terms of its depreciation and interest cost, and so it's got to fly to make money. Instead, they pull the engine off that's a problem, they put another engine on and the airplane flies away. In the meantime, they fix that other engine, and that may go on another airplane when it comes in when that plane needs an engine. So we don't have airplanes sitting on the ground waiting for parts at the central depot. On the other hand, unscheduled maintenance, you really don't have too much choice. You stand in line when you get to Heathrow if you have a problem and wait for the Heathrow entrepreneur to fix your plane. Now, he'll do it quickly because he knows that makes his service worth more, but still, you have to wait for the part, and hopefully the part will be on hand. Again, the advantage of flying a standard airplane. Another important thing in making money in the business is it pays to dominate any city pair. For example, if you have the most flights between Washington, D.C. and San Francisco, if a business person calls their travel agent and says, "I want to go from Washington to San Francisco," the travel agent will go down the list of flights, but he or she already knows that the most flights are by American, let's say. And so they'll check American, figuring that that's the best chance of finding the time the business traveler wants. If the agent can find that time, the search is over and the other airlines don't get a chance. Also, most people prefer to fly back on the same airline that they flew out on, maybe so they can find their baggage finally. But the point is that if we can get you on the flight to San Francisco on American, the chances are you'll fly back American. I'm assuming American flies Washington to San Francisco, incidentally. I know it does, Boston. So we want to get people on the flight, and the best way to get them on the flight, or the most probable way, is to offer the most offerings on a city pair. So it turns out that if you have the most offerings, you will get way more than your proportional share of the traffic between those two cities. Finally, the other thing that it seems obvious in this regard is that you ought to try to control the reservation system. There are only two of them in this country, the Sabre system, which American controls, and the Apollo system, which is controlled by United Airlines. There has been some antitrust considerations about this because, again, the way the game is played is that your travel agent is hooked to one or both of them. And when you ask for a booking between Washington and San Francisco, she enters the two towns in the computer, and guess what airline offerings are listed first? The airline that owns the system. And again, you see, if she can satisfy you with an offering from there, that's the end of the discussion, and the other guys don't get a shot at it. If it was the Apollo system, you can bet that the first offerings would be United. If it's Sabre, the first offerings will be American. So controlling the reservation system is a distinct advantage, and in fact, the government is beginning to become concerned that it might be too big an advantage. Conceivably, the airlines might be required to divest themselves of the reservation systems. I suppose another good idea is not to own fuel or the stuff that passes it as food. Again, instead of running catering operations at every airport you run into, why not just acquire it from a local caterer? And if you notice, the truck that pulled up next to your plane to fuel it doesn't say the name of the airline. It'll say Exxon or Shell or some major oil company. Similarly, the food truck, or whatever that stuff is, will say Sky Chef or something of that sort. That means, of course, that the airline does not own inventories of either meal services or fuel, except the stuff that's on the airplane. And that helps keep inventory investments down. Of course, they've avoided inventory investments in parts by buying standard airplanes that they can get repaired by anybody out in the field, and so the only parts inventory they need is at their central depot where they do scheduled maintenance. So this is a way to keep the investment down. Well, that pretty much describes, in my mind, how an airline would do business. After we come up with some measures of these things in the financials, we'll look to see if we can identify which company must be American on the basis of meeting our expectations of the right way to do it. I think I mentioned earlier, I'm no authority on beer. I can't drink this stuff, but my wife was since she graduated from the University of Wisconsin, where they know all about beer. So I've learned a little bit about it. It seems to me that one requirement is that you recognize who drinks beer. The big beer drinker in the United States is Joe Sixpack, a middle-aged guy who drinks a lot of beer. It has to be kept in the refrigerator by Mrs. Sixpack because she knows if it's not there, Joe is going to stop off with his friends at the bar on the way home, and she won't see him till late. So if she doesn't want Joe unhappy, she stocks beer in the refrigerator. So very often, Mrs. Sixpack is the one who buys the beer. However, it's Joe who decides what flavor or what kind of beer he's going to drink, it would appear. And Joe has an image of himself. If he looks in the mirror, he wouldn't be too pleased with it. And so we have to convince him that he's a real macho individual. So I guess the way to advertise and convince him to drink our brand is to show a bunch of great-looking young women, a lot more of them than a few macho men also shown in the same drink, dancing around with not too many clothes on and drinking Joe's beer. And if you think about it, the ads for beer on television always take that form. Great-looking women and a few men in the same scene, all of them in great shape, and they're drinking Joe's beer. The product is a low bulk value product. If you think about it, you're shipping water, and so transportation expenses may be significant. And that would suggest that perhaps rather than big breweries, we ought to have small ones located out near the cities where they serve. The trade-off, remember, Mr. Lang would say this is a chemical process plant, and you'd be much better off if you built big ones. However, you recognize then if you do build big ones, that transportation costs will be a significant part of the cost of beer. If you build big breweries, in any event, they are capital intensive because they are like chemical plants. We can even say a little something about the credit policy of a brewery. Remember, we decided we would probably not give too much longer for anybody to pay us than the operating cycle of that customer. That is, we'd look at how long he held our product in inventory, and then when he sold it, how long did it take him to collect it? That's a measure of how long it takes for him to turn product, let's say beer in this case, into money, and we want to get paid pretty promptly on that basis. Well, if you look at the distribution channel for beer, let's go down to the retailer. He's not likely to stock the stuff for a long period of time. First of all, it occupies a lot of space. Secondly, it doesn't age particularly well, so he wants to sell it quickly. So his days of inventory are minimal, and for the most part, beer is sold for cash. Or if a credit card is accepted, it's a bank card, which essentially is like paying by check. It's cash in 3 days. So the operating cycle of the retailer is short. Stepping back, to the wholesaler, the same thing applies. The wholesaler is going to have few days of receivables because he looks at the retailer's operating cycle and says, that guy turns it into money in a hurry, I want to get paid. So the wholesaler has few days of receivables, and again, he has no reason to carry the beer in inventory for long periods of time, so his operating cycle is also short. Well, the beer company sells to the wholesaler and therefore expects relatively prompt payment. So we would expect a well-run beer company to keep its days of receivables well down because it's selling through a channel that has fast operating cycles. That's as much as I know about beer. The next company on the list is Citicorp, which is the holding company for Citibank. So let's talk about banks. Banks are easy to run. Some people say the proof of it is that people from Princeton are able to run them, or at least Ivy Leaguers. What does it take to run a bank? Well, basically, you have to convince people to put their money in the bank at a low enough interest rate you pay them so that you can loan it out to other people at a higher interest rate and keep the difference. Now, there are only a few problems with that. First, we have to convince people to put money in our bank. Generally, to do that, we have to let them have access back to it anytime they want. That is, when you put your money in the bank, it's in a demand deposit account, and you have a right to write a check against it immediately, or at least a couple days after it clears. Therefore, you're not giving the money to the bank, you're loaning it to them. And you're loaning it to them short term. It is a current liability on the bank's books, the money that you deposit. They call it a demand deposit, but I wasn't going to make it that easy for you in the case, so I don't call them demand deposits. They're just listed among the current liabilities. But this is the only business that I know of that's looking for as many current liabilities as it can possibly find. That means deposits. The offsetting entry on the balance sheet is that when you make the deposit, it goes in the cash box. But because they have to pay you interest on their current liability, your demand deposit, what they have to do is get that money out of the cash box and loaned out as quickly as possible, typically long term. We'll loan it to Mike there to buy a house. And therein lies the beginning of the problem. If you loan it to Mike, will you get it back? And so one of the rules of running a successful bank is you'd like to get a reasonable proportion of what you loan out back with interest. Now, I don't want to push that too far because if you were absolutely certain you were going to get it back, you wouldn't be able to make many loans. There'd only be a few people so creditworthy that you could make the loans, and those people wouldn't have to pay much interest because they are creditworthy. So maybe we take a risk on Mike, but we make up for that risk by really sticking him with a very high interest rate. And that's part of the trade-off the bank makes. To whom should we loan money and at what interest rates? They're happy to loan people money on their credit cards. And those are fairly high-risk loans, but look at the interest rates that are being charged. They're up at 18 and 20%, where you can probably get a house mortgage for 9%. Of course, the house, again, is collateral, and that's one of the ways the bank will protect itself, trying to find collateral, just like the creditors to corporations, like mortgage bonds that can seize particular pieces of property. So collateral in the form of mortgages is useful. So there is the problem of getting it back, and that's the number one rule in a bank. Besides getting the money in cheap, we would like to loan it out and expect to get a reasonable proportion of it back with all the interest due on time. The other problem that bankers run into is a mouthful. The economists call it disintermediation. It's not as hard as it seems. Look, we loan money out, and if we're dumb enough to loan it out at a fixed interest rate, let's say 9%, and Congress and a president get back in power, such as we've seen a few years ago, and interest rates go up to 18, you've got your money loaned out at 9, but now interest rates out in the economy are at 18. The depositor is not going to sit happy receiving 4% on his deposit, so he's going to threaten to pull his money out unless you pay him more, maybe 10. Well, you see, you can't make too much money if you're paying the depositor 10 and you're only getting 9 on the loan. Disintermediation then occurs when the interest rate shifts so that the interest spread is unfavorable rather than favorable. Now, it can cut in both directions, and bankers usually make the great discovery that it's moved the wrong way too late. You see, if it gets out of hand, if interest rates go up, wouldn't it have been great if they had loaned the money out on a variable rate mortgage, so that as interest rates rose, they could charge Mike more for the money and therefore keep the interest rate positive, that it's spread positive, that is, get more from him than they have to pay the depositor. The trouble is, about the time they discover they ought to invent the variable rate mortgage, they encourage all these borrowers to take on variable rate mortgages, and then interest rates begin to drop, which means they have to lower the interest rate to the people, where if they locked them in with a fixed rate mortgage, they would have had a nice high interest rate for the next 25 years. So they usually discover it too late, and that's why I told you even Ivy Leaguers can run banks. So that's the game in playing a bank. You do have to worry about liquidity. After all, you can't afford to have money lying around, yet what if Joe over here, the depositor, wants his money? You've got to give it to him. More importantly, what if Joe and a lot of other people want their money? In fact, what if Joe was having trouble getting his money from you and he tells everybody else who's a depositor in the bank that he's having trouble? Wouldn't all you other depositors want your money immediately also? A run on the bank. Well, we have to protect ourselves from that, and we do that in two ways. First of all, we make it possible for the bank to borrow all the money it needs from the central bank, the Federal Reserve System. The principal role of the Federal Reserve is to provide liquidity for banks. All the publicity they get is that they establish or try to establish interest rates in the country. The real role they pay is that they provide liquidity for the bank. And if you need proof of it, pull out your wallet and look what it says on the top of each dollar bill. It doesn't say the United States government owes you a darn thing. It says it's a Federal Reserve note, which means the Federal Reserve has loaned the money to the bank. And the only reason it's good for paying anything is in very little letters on the thing it says this bill is good for payments in currency and all debts in the United States, which means if I pay you with it, you have to accept it, and that satisfies the debt. So the Federal Reserve takes care of liquidity. And further, let's make it a federal crime for Joe to start a run on a Federal Reserve member bank. So Joe, if you go around and tell everybody the bank's in trouble, we'll throw your butt in jail. And so that's how banks maintain liquidity. The oil business isn't too tough. We talked about it a little bit. The trick, of course, is to be lucky and find oil easily, in which case, of course, your accountants will say it's worth nothing. It probably makes sense to be fully integrated. That is, if you find oil, you also refine it and sell it. The reason for that is if you're going to build a refinery, we decided we were going to build world-class refineries that could efficiently utilize all the byproducts and stuff, and besides, Lang said to make it big anyway. Further, oil is relatively low bulk value, so we want to move it in very big tankers, Lang would tell us that, or pipelines. And you don't want to build those kinds of facilities unless you have some place to take it to. So why not be sure there's somebody ready to take it? Let's own the refinery that the crude oil comes to. But if you're going to make all that stuff into gasoline and stuff, how do you know you can sell it? The easiest way is to have your own service stations. So most of these firms also own a fully integrated operation. That's what makes them successful. They operate on a world scale size if possible. If they can't operate on a world scale, they try to co-locate with other refineries. It's not an accident that you see centers of refining like Philadelphia or Bayonne, New Jersey, or out on the West Coast. That's a number of refineries getting together so that they can make use of the terminal facility where the big tankers arrive, and also so they can make use of any pipelines that might be in the air, and finally, so that together they can create enough byproduct to encourage another guy to build a byproduct plant to use it. And so all these things dictate that you try to either be big yourself or connect with somebody who is big. You have to recognize you're dealing with a seasonal product when you're dealing with oil, because remember, when you make gasoline, you also make heating oil, and more gasoline is used in the summer and less heating oil, and vice versa in the winter, so you're going to end up storing stuff whether you like it or not. Further, if you're going to be integrated and own a big refinery, you better also have crude oil storage at the front end of it, because you can't afford to close down the refinery because the tanker didn't arrive with the latest shipment of oil. So you carry large inventories whether you like it or not. And if you think about it, there's also fairly substantial inventories out in the distribution system all the way down to the service station, which has big tanks of gas of various varieties and diesel fuel under the station in order to make fuel available to the people as they drive in. And that's as much as I think we have to know about how to make a buck in the oil business. How do you make a buck in the tire business? Well, it turns out you can't make many bucks in it. It isn't a very good business for a number of reasons. I think I've alluded to it earlier. First of all, it's two businesses. It's original equipment for new cars and replacement tires for tires as they wear out on those cars. The tire companies know that people who are satisfied with the tires they get on their first try on a new car, if they're satisfied, they'll stick with them. So if you wear out a set of Firestones and you're happy with them, chances are you'll try to replace them with Firestones. Ford knows that, and so does General Motors, and therefore, since Firestone would very much like to be on the new Ford, Ford just won't pay them very much for the tires. In fact, it comes down to almost the tire company bribing the automobile company to get aboard. And of course, the auto company doesn't want to have to store tires. Tires are bulky relative to their value. You notice they ship them wrapped very tight in paper, spiraled around the tire. To crush the tire down, that's an attempt to increase bulk value. Squeeze it so it doesn't occupy as much space, and it won't be quite as costly to move around. The auto companies don't want to stock it. They want just-in-time delivery, which means that as a tire manufacturer, to prove that you're a reliable deliverer and can deliver just in time, you have to carry large stocks of tires, preferably at a warehouse right next to the auto assembly plant. In addition, when Joe Sixpack needs a new tire for his car, yes, he's reasonably loyal to Firestones, but he's not going to drive around on a flat tire looking for a Firestone tire to fit his car. He expects to be able to find it easily, which means you need lots of places to distribute them, and the stock has to be on hand, including the tire size and price level that he wants, which means you need substantial retail inventories to support the sales of tires at the replacement business. As I think I mentioned, Henry Ford made everything that went on the automobile except a tire, and it's not surprising that he stayed out of the tire business. Although they did resolve the problem later. The son of the Ford family married the daughter of the Firestone family in the latest generation. Firestone has since gone out of business. I think Bridgestone from Japan bought them. They better go for good margins on those replacement tires to make up for the lack of margin on the tires they sell to the car manufacturers. And from what I can see, it looks like a fairly labor-intensive process to make a tire, principally because of the geometry. You know, you have to put that fiber in, and it's got to be oriented in the right direction. Some of it is radial, some of it goes around the periphery, some of it's in this direction to reinforce it, and then the rubber stripping is in, and then you close down and press and cook the rubber. There's a lot of equipment, but there's also a lot of people in it. So the labor productivity, which we'll figure out how to measure later, is probably not that high because you need a lot of people to generate the sales. Who's left? Well, we have to talk a little bit about utility business. The important thing to know about utilities are they have monopolies. You can't buy electricity in Florida from anyone but Florida Power and Light unless you want to generate your own with a diesel generator. And it's a necessity. And that's a license to steal if you have a monopoly on a necessity, and so utilities are typically regulated. They're regulated usually by either elected officials or people appointed by elected officials, which means they suffer from a phenomenon known as regulatory lag. That is, anytime they ask for a rate increase, you can be sure they will not get it in an even-numbered year, at least before November, because that's an election year. So rate increases don't come in 1996, at least until after November. Even then, the regulators have to look with alarm and study the problem carefully. There are three kinds of customers whom we might set rates for: residential, local business, and big business that operates across state lines. You're not going to raise rates to the local people if you can help it, because they have all the votes. You're not going to raise rates to the big guys because they'll move out of state if they can't get the power they need economically. And so the people who generally get the worst rates are the local businesses, because there's no place for them to go and they don't have any votes. So there are different rates, and they are discriminatory. The rates are set to offer the utility, I guess, what you would call a reasonable return on investment. No regulator, no politician is going to say he's going to allow them an obscene return. At the same time, it doesn't make sense to offer them a really miserable return, or they won't have the money to grow with to continue to provide electricity, and the rate makers would take all the grief if we began to have brownouts for lack of power. So the idea is to give them a reasonable rate, but given the regulatory lag, if we start at a reasonable level, but take our good time about making adjustments to the rate as inflation begins to eat up that rate, then the chances are they earn something less than a reasonable rate. So when we can find out what a reasonable rate of return is, we'd expect a utility to earn something somewhat less than that, simply because of the attitude of the regulators. Utilities recognize that they have both seasonal and even daily variations in demand. And I suggested in a previous lecture that the way to handle that is to have a base load provided typically by a capital-intensive process, which we can keep busy because the demand for the base load is always there, and then handle the excess of that either by producing with a less efficient system that can be turned off and on but isn't too capital-intensive, perhaps a fossil fuel system that burns diesel, or better yet, buy it off the grid. If we connect to the other utilities, some other utility has probably just built a new plant, and if they talk to Mr. Lang, they build a huge plant. And if they were smart, they built a plant that was bigger than what they needed because they were anticipating future growth. So they got that excess power, and we can probably buy it from them at just over variable cost. And of course, variable cost in producing power is pretty low if it's coming out of a capital-intensive facility. So let's buy our excess needs off the grid. The other advantage of buying off the grid is that some areas need power at different times of the day because of the time zone changes, and the north needs them more seasonally than the south does, because, at least for cold, where the south needs more power in the summertime for air conditioning. So power can be moved around pretty economically. If you think about it, it has very high bulk value in the sense that it doesn't take up much space for the value, and it moves at the speed of light through the wire. So we might be using electricity in here today that came from Washington State from a hydroelectric facility, which of course is a very capital-intensive dam. The other thing about electricity is you can't store it. A little bit in a battery, it's not very efficient. There's also a process known as pump storage. If the dam is producing more power than we need at a given time, we could take some of that power and drive electric motors, which in turn would drive pumps and drive the water back up to the upper side of the dam and let it come over it again. It's not efficient, but if you think about it, it may be just enough to make it worthwhile, because otherwise the power you've generated would be of no value at all. So that's called pump storage. That's as much as I know about utilities, but I think that'll help us identify a utility. A drug company, actually Bristol Myers, the example in the case, is a mixture between a drug and a healthcare and cosmetics and toiletries outfit. But there's a lot in common. First of all, pharmaceuticals and toiletries are generally distributed through retail operations, which means there are many levels of distribution and a lot of stock inventories. There is some limit with pharmaceuticals because they're often dated materials. They go out of date. The pharmaceutical business itself is extremely risky. You do R&D and you don't know if it's going to work. Even if it does work, you then have to prove to the federal people, the Food and Drug Administration, that A, it's safe. That is, that if people take it, they don't turn green. But that's not enough. You're also supposed to prove it's efficacious. That is, that it works for the disease it's meant to treat. The trouble is you do this by trying it on a sample of people, and Murphy's Law applies. When they approve it and it goes out to a larger sample, like the whole population, a certain percentage of the people will always turn green. And of course you'll be sued, and there's product liability claims to deal with. So there are risks in the drug business. However, the payoffs can be immense if you come up with a cure, or better yet, a non-cure that people have to take forever for some disease that they'll suffer from if they don't take it. Ideal drug is something that doesn't cure anybody, and therefore they have to take it forever, that a drug that people would be damn sorry if they forget to take it. Blood pressure medicine meets the first requirement, but people forget to take their blood pressure medicine because they don't know their blood pressure is elevated unless it's measured. And you want it to be relatively expensive as long as it's cheaper than the next alternative, because the insurance company will have to pay for it if the alternative is surgery or something really expensive. And of course, by the time you get the thing approved, there's the problem of how long your patent will run also. They finally gave up on this and said ordinarily patents run for 17 years, but it might take you 15 to get the drug approved. So as I understand, the new rule is you get 10 years on a patent from the day the drug is approved, no matter how long it took to get approval. The other thing you hope for is that doctors will use your drug for all sorts of things other than the things it's approved for. Once it's in the pharmacy, the doctor can prescribe it for anything he or she pleases. And so you're hoping that people will begin to use it in great quantities. If it's addictive, that would be even better, I suppose, although generally addictive drugs are not allowed. The margins ought to be awfully good because it's a high-risk business, and the returns should be very good. Women's clothing. Actually, I know a little bit about this because I was once the trustee for the Purple Door, which was the most expensive boutique in my hometown in bankruptcy. This was 20 years ago, and the cheapest dress in the store was $2,100. So I'm an authority on women's garments. But seriously, the significant thing about women's garments are they're very style sensitive. And typically there are 4 seasons. So 4 times a year, a garment manufacturer has to bet his or her company as to color, size, length, buttons, you name it. And the question is, how would you go about protecting yourself from these kinds of risks? You can't avoid the risk of design unless you want to do rip-offs, knock-offs of other people's designs. We're pretty good at that. In France, you can't do it because designs are copyrightable or patentable. However, we don't recognize copyrights or patents on clothing in the United States, so when a couturier gives a showing in Paris, we have codes that people can describe on the telephone, and there will be a knockoff copy in New York the next day. It may not be in the same fabric because they didn't have it available, but they can make a copy. So one way to avoid some of the risk is to steal the designs. The other way is to try to avoid any fixed costs, which would suggest, since clothing manufacturing is really labor intensive anyway, the reason it has to be is there's so many different sizes and things and so many different fabrics and shapes that it's too difficult to automate it, although they now automate the cutting with a laser cutter. A computer guides the laser thing around to cut the layers of fabric. But the sewing is all done by little old ladies in tennis shoes, and you want it done in as cheap a place as possible. Don't even own the sewing machines. Subcontract it to China or Mexico or someplace where labor's cheap. So you would expect a smart clothing manufacturer not to make anything, which would keep their capital investment down. How do you stop somebody from stealing your designs? One thing to try to do is monopolize the availability of raw material. That way, if somebody tries to copy it, it would take them so long to get their hands on the fabric, if the fabric is an important part of the design, that the season's done. You don't want to hold any finished goods inventory. The only place a dress belongs is out on the rack, because if a woman comes in to buy a dress, if it's not there in her size, they've lost the sale. So all dresses get put out onto the racks of department stores and boutiques. However, that means, since they may sit there for some time, although most of the sales are made at the beginning of the season, if they're going to sit there for any length of time, that means that the operating cycle of the retailers is fairly long, especially since they usually sell using their own credit cards, which adds another 45 days or so. That means that we can expect a retail or a garment manufacturer to have to carry a lot of days of receivables on the books. The way they avoid that, I think I suggested earlier, is factor the receivables, sell some of them. You sell the ones on the small stores because they're too much bothered to try to collect. Sell them to a factor who has a lot of paper from that small store and can bother to collect it. In the case of the larger stores, we may hold on to the paper because there's enough paper there to make it worth the collection process. That pretty much describes how to run, I think, a garment manufacturer and try to make money. How do you run a fast food business? Location, location, location. Which means you don't want to be captive to some landlord who will jack up the rent on you if he gets a chance, or better, or worse yet, demand a percentage rent. So the answer clearly is to try to own the locations. And of course, a good location is one where there's traffic and where you can have parking. You want to keep the thing very simple so you don't need expensive labor, because it is a labor-intensive process to actually manufacture whatever food you're going to produce. But the big investment is actually in the real estate. It's clear you're not going to have much in inventories because it's sell it or smell it. You probably won't have much in receivables because nobody offers you credit at a fast food stand, although you can use bank cards in some of them, but that's the same as paying cash as far as they're concerned. So you wouldn't expect to see many receivables on the books of a fast food operation. You try to keep all your inventories to a minimum. McDonald's, for example, actually offered its franchisees a pretty interesting deal. They said we could buy all the paper you need. That's the cups and lids and straws and boxes and bags and napkins, and cheaper than you can because we'll buy it in quantity and we'll distribute them to you at our price or our cost. Of course, the retailer said, forget it. And McDonald tried to force them to do it. It went all over the Supreme Court, and the court ruled that McDonald couldn't force them because that was a tie-in sale. But now ask yourself why the dealers didn't want it. Well, the answer, of course, is if McDonald's knew exactly how many straws, cups, lids, bags, boxes, and napkins you used, they'd know exactly what your sales were and therefore what royalties you owed them. So it makes it too easy for them to police the royalty collections if they know the paper sales or usage. Walgreens is a retail discount drug chain. You're familiar with these kinds of guys. They're typically located in strip malls. They have a huge variety of merchandise on the shelf. They want to turn it very quickly, if possible. And in order to get the turns, very much like a supermarket, they keep the margins down. If they own any real estate, it's probably a warehouse. The stores or wherever they can put them, they need a lot of them. They probably have to operate 24 hours or a lot of hours a day, because when people want pharmaceuticals, they want them now. Might make sense to have a pharmacy in the store, because the pharmacist also can serve as the father confessor / counselor to a customer, even for the patent medicines that are out on the shelf. They're called proprietaries as opposed to ethicals, which are sold on prescription or recommendation from the pharmacy. But that pharmacist, right now they claim they have the highest rating in terms of integrity among all the professions in the country. People trust their pharmacist the most, certainly not their lawyer. So we'll run a pharmacy, but if you do that, it's probably a 24-hour, 365-day operation. So there are the businesses. Now, what measures can we use to see if those businesses are indeed structured the way we think they ought to be structured? What financial measures can we use? And what we have to do are find financial variables that indeed are discriminating. You see, if we tried to decide that everybody could be measured by weight, and then we discovered that everybody weighs between 159 and 161 pounds, that really wouldn't be a discriminating measure that would tell the difference. Similarly, if we said, let's use height as a discriminator, but everybody turned out to be between 5'8" and 5'9", again, it wouldn't be discriminating. So before we pick a variable and say that's the way to tell one business from another, we have to make sure that the range for that variable is a pretty large one. It's a discriminating variable. And of course, it has to be something that's easy to measure. Well, if you look at the case, again, remember it's in your appendix, Exhibit 1 shows you the financial statements in the form of a balance sheet for all 10 companies. Of course, you're not told which company is which. We can look at the balance sheet and see if there's some discriminating variables there. For example, we might be interested in discriminating between companies by the amount of investment they make percentage-wise in plant and equipment. Now, you recognize these are all big companies, and they all have a lot of plant and equipment, but some of them have a much bigger percentage investment in them. Well, let's see if plant and equipment is a discriminating variable. Line 5 of the balance sheet shows that the range is from as high as 86%, that's company I, invested in plant and equipment, down to as low as 1%, company C, invested in plant and equipment. 86 to 1, that's a discriminating variable. What I've shown you here are the two highest, that was I and E, at the 86 and 85% levels, and the two lowest, C and J, which are down between 1 and 9%. So net plant and equipment is probably a pretty interesting variable, and remember, we learn a lot when we know about how much investment there is in plant and equipment. A lot of plant and equipment means a lot of fixed costs in the form of depreciation. It probably means fixed costs in the form of interest, and all the rules about having to stay busy, and all the rules that we don't want to be in that kind of structure unless we have a sure thing going for us with a lot of variation in sales and whatnot. So that's the typical kind of measure that we're going to continue to look at when we go into the next lecture.
Chapter 3: The Fateful Intersection of Two Visionaries. In the sprawling convention center of Silicon Valley, the annual tech conference, Innovate Now, was in full swing. The event was a magnet for the brightest minds in the industry, drawing in developers, entrepreneurs, and visionaries from all corners of the globe. Among the sea of attendees were Clara, with her groundbreaking AI syntactical trust, and Bidzil Bey, the guardian of compliance, who was making waves with his innovative approach to trust administration. Clara's presentation on the main stage was a resounding success. She spoke passionately about the potential of her AI system to revolutionize the way APIs were used, emphasizing the importance of transparency, control, and trust. As she showcased the capabilities of her system, the audience was captivated. Her vision of a transparent and efficient future resonated with many, but it struck a particular chord with one individual, Bidzil Bey. Bidzil, having just concluded his own presentation on the integration of AI into trust administration platforms, was intrigued by the parallels between their projects. He saw in Clara's AI syntactical trust a kindred spirit, a complementary force that could further enhance his own endeavors in trust management. As the presentations concluded and the attendees mingled, Bidzil made his way through the crowd, intent on introducing himself to Clara. Their meeting was serendipitous. As they exchanged ideas and insights, it became clear that their individual projects, when combined, had the potential to reshape the landscape of both trust administration and software development. Clara's expertise in APIs and Bidzil's deep understanding of trust dynamics could create a synergy that neither had anticipated. They spoke for hours, brainstorming potential collaborations and envisioning a future where their combined efforts could lead to unprecedented advancements in their respective fields. By the end of the conference, Clara and Bidzil had forged not only a professional partnership but also a deep mutual respect. They recognized in each other a shared passion for innovation and a commitment to pushing the boundaries of what was possible. It was the beginning of a collaboration that promised to redefine